to recognize that what we're talking about today are basically three constituencies. We're talking about seniors, care for seniors. We're talking about hospital care for those who are in crisis situations. And we're talking about children, colleagues. Those are the three constituencies that are impacted by these provider rate cuts. And the reason why I call them a cut is that a 3% increase and a 0% increase, or even a 2% increase, as we originally proposed, in an inflationary period of 6 or 7% is absolutely a cut, colleagues. We are asking providers to tighten their belt. And while this is going to impact my constituency in Lincoln, the communities that are going to be impacted the most are rural communities, by far. The absolute importance for funding for rural hospitals and the necessity of us to continue to support our hospitals, especially in rural communities, because if we don't, colleagues, then people in your districts will not be able to get the services that are life-saving. Colleagues, that does not make sense. And what we're going to end up with, if we continue to not fund the obligations of the state in terms of absolute priority services, emergency room services, is we're going to end up with more and more of these services shutting down. And we're already seeing it.
But what I look at is we are losing out on millions of dollars in state general funds. And from those millions of dollars state general funds, we will be losing out over the next 4 years of nearly $90 million in federal funds. $90 million in federal funds for two programs that, quite honestly, are the ones that have been driving poverty lower and have been covering more uninsured individuals in the state. But the message that we are sending to hospitals, Medicaid providers, assisted living, long-term care facilities, and children across the state right now is wait and see.
There is a great deal of disruption and many, many challenges that our healthcare providers on the front lines are still unwinding from. We know today that about 71% of counties in Nebraska are already maternal health deserts. And if we remove adequate funding, modest increases in funding to combat an already overburdened and incredibly stressed healthcare system, that hurts our ability to support our communities. That hurts our ability to ensure we have healthy families. That hurts our shared commitment to growing our state and our economy in every corner of Nebraska.
In our rural areas, the hospitals, the nursing homes are facing tremendous challenges. They haven't been able to keep up with inflation. They haven't been able to keep up with all the costs that are going on with all this. We've had nursing homes closed. We will be having more nursing homes closed. We will be having more hospitals, especially in the rural areas, facing challenges of closing or not, or how will they stay afloat.
We also have to remember that Nebraska hospitals continue to face some of the strongest financial headwinds in decades. And I know that specifically as I speak to my critical access hospitals in rural Nebraska. Workforce costs have risen 26.8% since 2020. Medical supply costs are up 25.4%, and drug costs have risen 42.5%. Unbelievable. 60 to 80% of hospitals' revenue is from government payers like Medicaid and Medicare, which we're discussing right now. And the average loss for treating a Medicaid patient is 60%. Nebraska hospitals care for Nebraskans 24/7. And as I speak specifically to my rural critical access hospitals and those elderly care providers that are in rural Nebraska, they're a lifeline for our rural citizens.
And paying an adequate provider rate is essential. It is essential to our rural communities. For the last 9 years, our great service providers have been hanging on by a thread, trying to find ways to make their operations work, trying to find ways to pay the going rate so that they can retain their outstanding, wonderful workforce that is committed to caring for our seniors, that is committed to caring for children, that is committed to caring for the most vulnerable in our community.
We need to address provider rates. One's health is critical to every other aspect of the good life. Our hospitals, both rural and urban, have been and continue to be challenged with major cost increases which have been cited.
If we do not help our hospitals keep up with inflation, what happens? Well, for one thing, some of those critical in-the-moment care options will still be available so long as the hospital is available, if they can stay afloat. You know, we say, oh, well, people will stay afloat, they'll stay afloat. But we've seen what's happened with our long-term health care facilities in Nebraska. We're actually decreasing our support to these folks as Medicaid, or as inflation.
1 minute.
As inflation happens. So I urge you all to support the provider rates for all of our providers in Nebraska. Thank you, Mr. President.
And by keeping this rate flat, we are telling them you have to pick up wherever you can. And colleagues, I think we have a responsibility, just like we have been doing investments, responsibility to do as much as we possibly can to give taxpayers their money back like we've done this session, but also utilize the taxpayer funds that we have received for basic services that we know are working and have oversight over our executive branch. And our executive branch has oversight through DHHS and the work that they do here. I want that taxpayer money to come back to us, and I want to make sure it's leveraged to good use for our workforce. In rural communities, this is going to impact even more.
We're going to lose our rural health care providers if we cannot properly fund them. And I don't believe 3% is enough. I think the committee needed to be more ambitious than they were at 3 and 2. But I can tell you that once we do the study on interim study, I think we're going to have all the pieces we need to move that forward. Let's be clear that when you look at most rural hospitals, and really any of the hospitals, and in North Platte, we have a hospital that we receive about 75% of our costs from Medicare and Medicaid. They represent about 60% to 70% of the total payers. Guess where the rest of that gets made up? Blue Cross and Blue Shield and Medica, the two primary health insurance providers in the state. So at the end of the day, if we don't adequately provide for Medicaid, which is state funded, we're going to put a bigger burden on our insurance companies, like the health insurance companies, who are going to have to raise premiums to offset those additional costs that they're going to be faced with for their insured customers that are getting care in these hospitals. I don't think that's the right place for that burden. I think it needs to be placed more with the state as a whole. We need to understand that hospitals are required to treat everyone who comes. Thank you, Mr. President. Is required to treat every patient that presents themselves. Believe it or not, hospitals are faced with a situation today where you cannot release a patient unless they have a safe place to be released to. And guess who pays for that once they no longer need hospital care but are still housed there? It's the hospital. That's an unsustainable business model. So ultimately, these rates need to go up, but I don't believe it's an emergency this year. I don't think it's worthy of a veto override. Let's take the bigger view, come back next year, decide what we need to do next year, stick with the 3% this year.